It was a quiet, unassuming town, the kind where everyone knew each other by name and the streets carried the faint scent of freshly baked bread and autumn leaves. Nestled between rolling hills and dense forests,
Look at
the houses were
beautiful
neat,
view
the lawns
today.
meticulously trimmed, and the lives of the residents appeared orderly,
gardening.
predictable,
Can
almost
you throw
painfully
in here,
normal.
please?
But beneath the calm facade, a shadow loomed, one that had been hidden for decades, carefully buried behind polite smiles and polite nods at neighborhood gatherings. The Henderson family, long regarded as pillars of the community, seemed like the epitome of stability. William Henderson, a respected businessman with a charm that could disarm even the most skeptical, and his wife, Margaret, a devoted mother and active member of the local church, had built their life on appearances. Their two children, Laura and Daniel, were bright, talented, and well-behaved, earning admiration from teachers, neighbors,
Is that
and
your
friends
favorite car
alike.
today?
Yet, as with so many true crime stories, the reality simmering beneath the surface was far darker. Secrets, lies, and long-forgotten grievances had been silently festering, shaping choices and actions that, if exposed, could shatter everything the family had worked so hard to maintain. On the evening of October 12th, a single phone call would unravel the carefully constructed veneer of normalcy, dragging hidden truths into the harsh light of reality. It began with a simple inquiry, a missing family heirloom, a question asked out of casual curiosity, but the answer would reveal far more than anyone could have anticipated. In that moment, the Henderson household, like so many families harboring dangerous secrets, teetered on the precipice between civility and catastrophe. The story that would follow, one of betrayal, obsession, and unimaginable loss, was not born overnight. It had been quietly growing for years, nourished by fear, pride, and the desperate hope that no one would ever discover what lay hidden beneath the polished exterior. As investigators would later piece together, the cracks had always been there, subtle and almost invisible to the outside eye. Friends, colleagues, and neighbors would struggle to reconcile the image of the perfect family with the grim reality revealed in the aftermath. By the time the first evidence was discovered, it was too late to stop the tragic cascade that would consume lives, destroy reputations, and leave an entire community grappling with disbelief, horror, and the haunting question: how well do we really know the people we think we love? The Henderson family story, like many in true crime, is a chilling reminder that appearances can be deceiving, that darkness often hides in the most familiar places, and that a single secret, carefully guarded, long ignored, or recklessly exposed, can have consequences that ripple far beyond what anyone could have imagined. The origins of the Henderson family's hidden turmoil were, in many ways, rooted in the past, decades before the tragedy that would eventually consume them. William Henderson had grown up in a small industrial town several hours away, a place marked by economic hardship and rigid social expectations. His father, a stern and uncompromising man named Harold Henderson, demanded perfection in every aspect of life, instilling in William a drive for success that teetered dangerously close to obsession. Mistakes were never tolerated. Failures were met with punishment rather than guidance, and affection, when it appeared, was always conditional. William had carried this legacy into adulthood, outwardly displaying charm, confidence, and ambition, while internally harboring a relentless need for control and an almost pathological fear of vulnerability. Margaret, by contrast, had grown up in a household that emphasized appearances over authenticity, in a wealthy suburban enclave where reputation mattered more than personal happiness. Her mother, Eleanor, was known for her meticulous hosting of social events, for the flawless presentation of her home, and for an unwavering insistence that the Henderson name, her maiden family name, be preserved in the highest regard. In many ways, Margaret's upbringing had taught her that secrecy was synonymous with survival, that private matters should never spill into public view, and that family loyalty sometimes demanded the suppression of truth. When William and Margaret met at a charity gala in their late 20s, it seemed as if the universe had aligned two people who shared complementary ambitions and equally rigorous ideas of control. They married after a whirlwind courtship, celebrated by friends and family as the perfect match, and soon established a home that mirrored the ideals instilled in them from birth: impeccable, orderly, and seemingly unassailable. Yet, as history often demonstrates, the behaviors and patterns of one generation can subtly, insidiously shape the next, and the Hendersons were no exception. Behind closed doors, the pursuit of perfection created a breeding ground for tension, silent resentment, and unspoken rules. Minor disagreements could escalate into weeks of cold silence. Trivial infractions were catalogued and referenced later in arguments, and the pressure to maintain appearances left little room for authentic emotional expression. Laura, the eldest child, learned early to navigate this environment with careful precision, adopting a persona of compliance, cheerfulness, and excellence in every endeavor, from academics to extracurriculars. Daniel, younger by 3 years, was more sensitive, more prone to questioning the rigid expectations of his household, and quietly harbored doubts and anxieties that he felt unable to express. Over time, the family's dynamic became a delicate balance of outward normalcy and inward tension, a fragile ecosystem in which the smallest disturbance could trigger disproportionate consequences. It was within this context, an environment that prized secrecy, control, and the preservation of a flawless public image, that the seeds of tragedy were planted. By the time William discovered a series of unsettling discrepancies in his personal and professional life, and Margaret began noticing Laura and Daniel's increasingly secretive behaviors, the groundwork had already been laid for events that would spiral beyond anyone's capacity to contain. Each family member, bound by unspoken rules and fear of exposing imperfections, became complicit in a silent dance of concealment. The first real signs of collapse would emerge not from violence or criminal intent, but from small, seemingly innocuous choices that, in retrospect, were the precursors to the eventual catastrophe. And just as in so many true crime narratives, hindsight would reveal that the tragedy was neither sudden nor accidental. It was the inevitable outcome of years of repression, miscommunication, and the relentless pursuit of an impossible ideal. By the time the Henderson children reached their teenage years, the undercurrents of tension and secrecy in the household had become nearly impossible to ignore. Laura, at 16, had mastered the art of concealment, a skill born out of necessity in a home where curiosity or candor could provoke conflict. She maintained an impeccable academic record, participated in extracurricular activities, and was active in the local youth community, all the while carefully curating the image of the perfect daughter. But beneath the surface, she wrestled with the psychological toll of constant vigilance. The anxiety that came from monitoring her own words, her gestures, even her thoughts, to ensure that nothing could be interpreted as defiance or weakness. Daniel, on the other hand, had become increasingly withdrawn, retreating into books, music, and clandestine late-night excursions with friends, which he carefully concealed from his parents. His quiet rebellion was subtle yet persistent, manifesting in small but telling ways. A missed curfew, whispered conversations behind closed doors, and occasional bursts of anger that seemed to emerge without warning. Within this pressure cooker environment, the dynamics between the siblings were complicated. Laura often assumed the role of protector, attempting to shield Daniel from the full weight of their parents' expectations, while Daniel oscillated between resentment for his sister's perceived compliance and admiration for her apparent ability to navigate the treacherous terrain of their household. It was during this period that the first cracks in the family's veneer of normalcy began to appear externally, though outsiders were blissfully unaware. Neighbors noticed subtle signs. The tense body language at social gatherings, the occasional sharp retort that quickly vanished into forced smiles, and fleeting glimpses of arguments behind curtained windows. Teachers remarked on Daniel's sudden changes in behavior, while Laura's flawless performance in school and public life only heightened the contrast, suggesting a perfection that seemed increasingly unnatural. Meanwhile, William and Margaret remained largely oblivious to the emotional complexity brewing beneath the surface, preoccupied with maintaining the household's outward appearance and enforcing a strict adherence to rules that they themselves had inherited from their own parents. Their attempts to assert control often backfired, intensifying the very behaviors they sought to suppress. As the children matured, small incidents accumulated, forming a pattern that would later be recognized as the prelude to disaster. A missing item here, a lied about outing there, and subtle shifts in tone and demeanor signaled that the children were beginning to harbor secrets of their own. Secrets that would eventually intersect with the older, more insidious family secrets harbored by William and Margaret themselves. It was a period of quiet yet relentless tension, where each decision, each withheld word, and each carefully managed interaction contributed to an increasingly fragile equilibrium. In hindsight, the teenage years of Laura and Daniel were a critical stage in the unfolding tragedy. A time when psychological pressures, miscommunication, and hidden resentments converged to create an environment ripe for the kind of explosive revelation that would ultimately upend the family's carefully constructed reality. What outsiders saw as a model family life, two well-behaved, accomplished teenagers, attentive and respected parents, was, in truth, a delicate facade, hiding a network of unspoken rules, buried conflicts, and emotional turbulence that threatened to erupt at any moment. It is here, in these formative years, that the story of the Henderson family began to shift from a narrative of outward success to one of hidden desperation, laying the groundwork for the tragic events that would later dominate headlines and captivate the attention of investigators, journalists, and a shocked community. The tension simmering in these years was not just a matter of adolescent rebellion or parental oversight. It was a reflection of decades of secrecy, control, and unresolved trauma that had silently dictated the family's trajectory. The first tangible signs that the Henderson family's hidden world was beginning to unravel appeared one cold November evening, when a routine household inspection unexpectedly spiraled into confrontation. It started innocuously enough. William had noticed small discrepancies in his home office, missing documents that, on the surface, seemed trivial but carried significance in his meticulous, detail-oriented mind. Financial records were slightly altered, letters misplaced, and one of his carefully catalogued personal journals had gone missing entirely. Margaret, meanwhile, had discovered subtle irregularities in the family's private correspondence. Notes that hinted at clandestine meetings, whispered conversations behind closed doors, and vague references to issues that must remain secret. Initially, both parents dismissed these as minor lapses or the carelessness of their children. But the sense of unease deepened over the following weeks. William began to scrutinize Daniel's late-night activities more closely, tracking phone usage and questioning friends' parents under the guise of casual interest. Margaret observed Laura's increasingly defensive responses whenever topics of family history or private matters arose, noticing the careful control in her tone, her posture, her avoidance of eye contact. The tension within the household escalated, fueled by the parents' growing suspicion and the children's instinct to protect themselves from what they sensed as looming judgment. It was during one particularly tense evening, after an argument over a seemingly minor issue, a misplaced household key, that the fragile equilibrium shattered. Words were exchanged with a sharpness that shocked both the parents and the children, each accusation cutting deeper than intended, exposing layers of resentment and fear that had been carefully buried for years. In the aftermath, Laura and Daniel retreated to their rooms, leaving William and Margaret to grapple with a realization they had long resisted. The family's harmony was an illusion. The confrontation acted as a catalyst, setting into motion a series of events that would expose long-held secrets, some of which predated the children's birth. Investigators would later describe this period as the turning point, the moment when hidden dynamics that had festered in silence for decades became impossible to contain. The Henderson household, once a model of outward composure, had become a pressure cooker of suppressed truths, each member bracing for the next revelation. It was also the moment when the patterns of control, secrecy, and fear that had defined the family began to manifest in tangible, dangerous ways. Small, seemingly inconsequential decisions, the choice to withhold information, to manipulate perception, or to ignore troubling signs, were now creating a web of deception that would soon ensnare everyone involved. By the end of that November, the Hendersons were living in a state of constant vigilance, each interaction carefully calculated to prevent further escalation. The children, already accustomed to navigating emotional minefields, became adept at subterfuge, while the parents, unaware of the full extent of what they were missing, doubled down on their attempts to assert authority. In retrospect, it was clear that the family's decline was no longer gradual. It had entered a stage of acceleration. Each secret, each concealed emotion, each suppressed memory now carried the potential to ignite a chain reaction of events that would culminate in tragedy. Within the walls of the Henderson home, the foundations of trust and safety had eroded, leaving behind a fragile, volatile structure that was waiting for a single spark to ignite disaster. And as with many true crime cases, the spark came not from an external threat but from within. A convergence of miscommunication, fear, and unresolved pasts that made the unfolding catastrophe almost inevitable. As December approached, the atmosphere inside the Henderson household grew increasingly oppressive, an invisible weight pressing down on every conversation, every gesture, and every interaction. Laura and Daniel, acutely aware that the smallest misstep could trigger suspicion or punishment, developed a meticulous system of communication designed to mask their activities and intentions. Notes were left in obscure locations, coded phrases were exchanged in passing, and subtle signals, a glance, a nod, a hand movement, became the language of survival. The psychological toll of living in this environment was profound. Sleep became restless, meals were often eaten in tense silence, and laughter, once a natural part of family life, was now scarce and stilted. For William and Margaret, the mounting unease was a mixture of frustration and denial. William, whose life had been defined by control and order, struggled with the creeping realization that his children were deliberately keeping secrets from him. Margaret, meanwhile, oscillated between concern and a fierce insistence on maintaining appearances, fearing that any acknowledgement of discord would reflect poorly on the family's reputation in the community. Amid this tension, a series of minor incidents began to converge into patterns that could no longer be ignored. Valuable items disappeared. Small, sentimental objects at first, and then documents and personal belongings of greater significance. Friends and neighbors, who had always considered the Hendersons a model family, began noticing subtle signs of dysfunction. Hurried conversations that stopped abruptly when outsiders approached, evasive answers to simple questions, and the occasional hint of agitation in the parents' eyes. These external cues, however, were drowned out by the family's internal focus on managing the spiraling complexity of their private lives. It was during one particularly tense afternoon that the first truly alarming discovery occurred. Laura, in an attempt to protect a long-held secret, inadvertently left a letter addressed to an unknown recipient in plain view. The contents of the letter revealed fragments of hidden truths, exposing emotional conflicts and decisions that had been meticulously concealed for years. William discovered the letter first, his face tightening as he read, a mixture of disbelief, anger, and fear flashing across his features. Margaret arrived shortly thereafter, her expression shifting rapidly from confusion to panic as she realized the potential implications of what had been uncovered. The confrontation that followed was immediate and intense. Words were exchanged with a force born of fear and desperation, accusations flying like shards of glass, each sentence cutting deeper than intended. In the hours that followed, the family retreated into separate rooms, each member grappling with the enormity of the revelations and the uncertainty of what would come next. Unbeknownst to them, these events marked the point at which private tensions transitioned into irreversible actions. The initial discovery, though seemingly small and isolated, had opened a door that could not be closed. Investigators would later describe this as the moment when the hidden mechanisms of control, secrecy, and fear began to unravel with unstoppable momentum. By this time, the family's intricate web of lies and half-truths had become a dangerous labyrinth, and any misstep could trigger consequences that would extend far beyond the immediate household. The stage was set for tragedy, the delicate balance that had allowed the Henderson family to maintain their public image now collapsing under the weight of secrets, suspicion, and escalating emotional strain. What had once been a household of appearances, a facade of perfection, harmony, and control, was now a house teetering on the brink of disaster, each member caught in a psychological struggle that neither experience nor desire could fully mitigate. In hindsight, it became painfully clear that the events of that December afternoon were not simply an isolated incident, but the ignition point for a tragic sequence that would consume the family and leave an indelible mark on everyone connected to them. In the weeks that followed the discovery of Laura's letter, the Henderson household descended into an almost unbearable tension, as if every wall, every room, and every object carried the weight of unspoken truths. The family's daily routines became exercises in avoidance, each member navigating a minefield of suspicion, guilt, and fear. William, consumed by a need to reassert control, began obsessively monitoring the household. Checking phone records, reviewing financial transactions, and interrogating family friends under the guise of casual conversation. Margaret, while outwardly calm, moved through the house with a barely concealed anxiety, arranging schedules, controlling interactions, and attempting to anticipate and prevent any further exposure of the secrets she feared would irreparably damage their family's reputation. Laura and Daniel, caught in the crossfire of parental authority and their own private concerns, became increasingly secretive and mistrustful. Their once close sibling bond, forged in early years of quiet complicity, began to fracture under the strain of mutual fear and the relentless pressure to navigate a household that now felt hostile and unpredictable. As the tension escalated, minor incidents, misplaced keys, accidental overheard conversations, or innocuous questions, were magnified into crises that sparked arguments lasting hours. Family dinners, once a time of unity, had devolved into silent, strained affairs where every glance and every word was measured for potential threat. Friends and neighbors, sensing something was wrong despite the family's best efforts at concealment, began expressing concern. Yet even in these moments of external observation, the Hendersons maintained a facade of normalcy, the intricate choreography of deception and control continuing to function with precarious precision. Behind closed doors, however, the psychological toll was immense. Insomnia, anxiety, irritability, and subtle expressions of despair became common among every member of the household. The children, in particular, struggled with a profound sense of isolation. Laura, who had long been the model child, found herself questioning not only her parents' motivations but also her own complicity in maintaining the family's secrets. Daniel, increasingly withdrawn, began documenting his thoughts in a journal, a silent rebellion and coping mechanism that allowed him to articulate feelings he dared not speak aloud. It was during one evening, after a particularly heated confrontation in the kitchen, that the first irreversible actions began to take shape. Harsh words escalated into physical expressions of anger, and the boundaries that had once prevented outright confrontation eroded. In the following days, minor deceptions escalated into deliberate concealment, with each family member taking steps to protect themselves from perceived threats. The convergence of fear, guilt, and desperation created a feedback loop, amplifying emotions and decisions that would have seemed inconceivable just weeks earlier. Psychologists reviewing the case later described this period as the point at which latent family dysfunction transformed into an active, destabilizing force, a stage in which the combination of secrecy, control, and unresolved emotional trauma set the stage for the tragic events that would soon follow. By the end of that turbulent month, the Henderson home had become a tense, unstable environment, where every action carried consequences far beyond their immediate perception, and where the smallest spark, an argument, a misstep, a revelation, had the potential to ignite a series of irreversible events. And it was precisely within this fragile high-pressure atmosphere that the first real tragedy was quietly taking root, unseen by neighbors, unnoticed by friends, and unacknowledged by the parents who believed they were still in control. The first unmistakable signs that the Henderson family's long-concealed dysfunction had erupted into genuine crisis occurred one fateful evening in early January. The night had begun like any other, cold, dark, and deceptively ordinary, but it would soon become the catalyst for events that no one in the family could have anticipated. Tensions that had been simmering for months finally reached a breaking point when a routine disagreement over household responsibilities escalated into a fierce argument between William and Daniel. The disagreement, initially about something trivial, a misplaced set of keys, quickly morphed into a confrontation over trust, secrecy, and long-standing resentments that neither party had previously articulated. Words, sharp and unrelenting, were exchanged, each sentence laden with years of unspoken grievances, hidden fears, and mounting frustration. Margaret, attempting to mediate, found herself caught in the crossfire, her own anxieties magnifying the intensity of the conflict. In the midst of the argument, Laura, who had been quietly observing from her bedroom, inadvertently discovered evidence that confirmed suspicions she had long harbored, information that implicated her parents in decisions and behaviors far more troubling than she had ever imagined. The revelation struck her with the force of a physical blow, leaving her frozen, uncertain of how to respond. In that moment, the carefully maintained equilibrium of the Henderson household shattered entirely. Panic, fear, and a sense of helplessness permeated the air, leaving each family member scrambling to regain a semblance of control. It was during this chaotic night that small actions, secret phone calls, hurried messages, and whispered conversations began to compound, each one a thread in the growing tapestry of tragedy. By the time the argument subsided, the family had entered a stage of psychological and emotional instability from which there would be no immediate recovery. The once ordered household now resembled a battlefield, with trust eroded, loyalties questioned, and the boundaries of safety and security irrevocably compromised. Neighbors, hearing muffled voices and occasional raised tones, began to speculate but were unaware of the true gravity of the situation unfolding behind closed doors. Unbeknownst to anyone outside, the events of that night had set in motion a sequence of decisions and reactions that would soon culminate in irreversible consequences. Investigators later noted that this period represented the tipping point, where latent familial dysfunction transitioned into overt, destructive behavior. Every choice made after that night carried a weight that could not be undone, and every secret,
later noted
every
that
act
this
of
period
concealment
represented the
became
tipping
increasingly
point.
dangerous. Laura and Daniel, now acutely aware of the full extent of the family's hidden truths, attempted to navigate the escalating tension with caution, but the pressure was relentless. William and Margaret, each blinded by their own fears and pride, failed to recognize the growing divide within their family and the potential for catastrophe. By the following morning, the Henderson household was no longer merely dysfunctional. It was a volatile environment teetering on the edge of tragedy, a place where one wrong decision, one misplaced word, or one impulsive act could irrevocably alter the course of every life within it. This night, seemingly ordinary in its beginning, would later be remembered as the moment when the hidden mechanisms of control, secrecy, and fear collided violently with human vulnerability, setting the stage for the devastating events that would define the Henderson family story. And as with so many true crime narratives, the tragedy was born not from an external force, but from the very dynamics that had existed within the family for years. An explosive combination of secrecy, repression, and the inexorable consequences of living behind a carefully constructed facade. In the days following that fateful night, the Henderson household descended further into chaos, as the psychological strain and mounting tension began to manifest in increasingly dangerous ways. Each family member became hypervigilant, meticulously observing the actions and words of the others, attempting to predict, control, or suppress behaviors that might trigger another explosive confrontation. Laura, now acutely aware of the magnitude of the secrets surrounding her family, found herself paralyzed between fear and responsibility. She grappled with the knowledge that revealing what she knew could dismantle the fragile remnants of the household entirely, yet remaining silent felt like a betrayal to both herself and her conscience. Daniel, whose withdrawal had deepened in the wake of the argument, began spending long hours away from home, seeking refuge in friends' houses, local libraries, and late-night walks through the neighborhood. These absences, though temporary, heightened William's paranoia and frustration, fueling a cycle of suspicion and control that only intensified the family's collective stress. Margaret, meanwhile, oscillated between frantic attempts to maintain appearances and moments of quiet despair, silently mourning the collapse of the idealized family she had long envisioned. Each interaction became a delicate balance of negotiation, avoidance, and subtle manipulation, as the family members tried desperately to preserve a sense of normalcy while navigating the treacherous emotional landscape that had come to define their home. It was during one particularly frigid evening, while snow fell heavily outside, that the first irreversible physical consequences of the family's unraveling became tragically apparent. A heated argument erupted between William and Laura, fueled by accumulated frustrations, unspoken accusations, and long-held resentments. The argument escalated rapidly, voices raised and words sharpened by years of suppressed emotion, until a moment of physical confrontation occurred. A shove, a knockover of an object, the accidental breaking of something once cherished. In that instant, the fragile psychological barriers that had prevented outright catastrophe gave way. The household, already a pressure cooker of tension, became an arena for uncontrolled emotional and physical reactions, each act compounding the danger for everyone involved. What began as a single, isolated incident quickly cascaded into a series of destructive actions, including frantic attempts to conceal evidence, desperate efforts to control perceptions, and escalating confrontations that involved all four family members. Outside observers, including neighbors and friends, remained unaware of the full extent of the crisis, perceiving only the occasional hint of conflict or tension that they could not fully comprehend. Internally, however, the Henderson family was spiraling toward a point of no return. Psychologists reviewing the case later noted that this phase represented a critical threshold in familial crises, where secrecy, repression, and unaddressed trauma converged to create conditions ripe for tragedy. Every choice, every action, every attempt at control became a double-edged sword, escalating the stakes with each passing hour. By the time emergency responders were eventually called to the scene, the family dynamic had already transformed from dysfunctional to catastrophic. The consequences of years of hidden secrets, control, and suppression had reached their apex, resulting in events that no one could have easily anticipated, and leaving behind a trail of emotional, psychological, and physical devastation. In the end, the tragedy was neither sudden nor random. It was the inevitable outcome of a lifetime of secrecy and unspoken conflicts, magnified by the pressures of an environment in which every truth had been carefully hidden, every feeling suppressed, and every relationship conditioned by fear and control. The Henderson home, once a symbol of perfection and stability, had become a stark testament to the destructive power of secrets left unchecked, and the devastating consequences that can follow when appearances are valued above honesty, empathy, and human connection. In the immediate aftermath of the climactic events, the Henderson family's life as they knew it ceased to exist. The once quiet streets that had carried only the occasional hum of daily suburban life now became the backdrop for whispers, speculation, and rumors that spread like wildfire throughout the community. Friends, neighbors, and colleagues struggled to reconcile the image of the perfect family they had long admired with the chaos and devastation now known to have occurred behind closed doors. Investigators, responding to the emergency calls and piecing together accounts from all involved, were struck by the complexity of the situation. The intricate web of secrecy, control, and psychological manipulation that had slowly built over decades. Interviews with family members revealed a family trapped in cycles of fear, obedience, and silent suffering, each choice and action carefully measured to maintain appearances, yet each ultimately contributing to the collapse of the household. Laura and Daniel, now thrust into the harsh reality of exposure, were left grappling not only with personal trauma but also with the stark realization that their lives would never return to normal. Schoolmates, friends, and extended family members attempted to provide comfort, but the magnitude of betrayal, shock, and grief made support both essential and profoundly difficult to navigate. For William and Margaret, the consequences of their long-held control and secrecy became immediately tangible. Legal authorities, social workers, and mental health professionals descended on the home, scrutinizing every decision made in the months, years, and even decades prior. What had been considered discipline, protection, or family structure by the parents was reinterpreted as coercion, manipulation, and, in some cases, emotional abuse. The revelation was not merely a personal tragedy but also a cautionary tale for the wider community, highlighting the often hidden complexities of family life, the dangers of unaddressed psychological trauma, and the catastrophic potential of long-buried secrets. Media coverage, when it arrived, sensationalized the events, painting vivid, sometimes exaggerated pictures of the family's dysfunction. Yet none of the public narratives could truly capture the depth of fear, despair, and desperation experienced by those who had lived within the household. Psychologists and criminologists studying the case emphasize that the Henderson tragedy was emblematic of a broader pattern seen in families under extreme psychological strain. Secrecy, rigid control, and repression create environments in which even minor conflicts can escalate into full-blown crises. In the weeks that followed, Laura and Daniel began the painstaking process of untangling their personal identities from the environment that had shaped them, learning to trust, communicate, and confront emotions that had been suppressed for years. William and Margaret, now facing both legal and social consequences, confronted the reality that the very measures they had taken to preserve family integrity had instead catalyzed its destruction. Community members, too, were forced to reflect, questioning assumptions about perfection, appearances, and the unseen struggles of those around them. The Henderson family's story, while intensely personal, became a symbol of the dangerous consequences of secrecy and control, a narrative that resonated far beyond the walls of a single home. As months turned into years, the ripple effects of the tragedy continued to influence relationships, career paths, and personal well-being, illustrating that the repercussions of family secrets extend long after the immediate events have passed. In many ways, the aftermath was as complex and harrowing as the events themselves, revealing that tragedy does not conclude with the initial act of exposure or violence. It lingers, shaping lives, perceptions, and the collective memory of everyone touched by the events. As the months unfolded, the Henderson family's tragedy rippled outward, touching every corner of their lives and leaving long-lasting scars on both individuals and the community. The legal investigations intensified, with authorities examining financial records, personal correspondence, and even psychological evaluations to reconstruct the chain of events that had led to the catastrophe. William faced scrutiny not only for the household's emotional climate, but also for decisions in his professional life that intersected with the family's personal secrets. Margaret, similarly, endured the relentless scrutiny of social workers and legal professionals, her every past action dissected to understand how secrecy and control had escalated to such devastating consequences. Laura and Daniel, while initially relieved to have the truth acknowledged, were forced into a world of therapy sessions, court testimonies, and public scrutiny, navigating a delicate balance between personal healing and legal obligations. Each day became a complex negotiation, with mental health professionals guiding them through the difficult terrain of trauma recovery, while also managing the pervasive influence of media narratives that sought sensationalism over understanding. The community, meanwhile, oscillated between shock, compassion, and judgment, struggling to reconcile the outwardly pristine image of the Henderson household with the grim reality that had been uncovered. Extended family members grappled with feelings of betrayal, guilt, and helplessness, questioning how warning signs had been missed and what role they might have inadvertently played in perpetuating the secrecy. Psychologists later emphasized that the Henderson case illustrated a broader truth about family dynamics. That long-term secrecy and control can have compounding effects, creating conditions in which even minor incidents can escalate into irreversible tragedies. Support systems, friends, relatives, and local organizations attempted to intervene, offering counseling, guidance, and care, yet the emotional complexity proved challenging to address. Each individual's path to recovery became highly personal. Laura, determined to reclaim autonomy and redefine her identity outside the shadow of the family secret, immersed herself in academic pursuits and community engagement, while Daniel focused on understanding his own emotional responses, journaling extensively, and exploring creative outlets for his trauma. William and Margaret, confronted by the consequences of their decades-long pursuit of control and perfection, faced profound self-reflection, often oscillating between denial, remorse, and the slow acknowledgement of their role in the family's collapse. Legal proceedings became not only a measure of accountability but also a public education on the dangers of suppressed emotion, secrecy, and rigid control within family units. Reporters documented every revelation, and documentaries were later produced to examine the psychological and social underpinnings of the tragedy, analyzing the subtle signals that had been overlooked, the decisions that had compounded risk, and the intricate web of cause and effect that had led to the catastrophic outcome. Over time, the Henderson family story became a case study in psychology and criminology programs, illustrating the profound impact of familial secrecy and the ways in which emotional suppression can lead to extreme consequences. The story also prompted local communities to re-evaluate their assumptions about perfect households, encouraging more open communication, early intervention in family disputes, and awareness of the unseen pressures that can exist behind the facade of normalcy. Even years later, the emotional and social consequences persisted, as survivors, family members, and community members continued to process the tragedy, often struggling with questions of blame, responsibility, and the long-term effects of secrets that were never meant to be exposed. The events underscored a painful truth, that sometimes the most devastating threats are not external, but lie quietly within the walls of the homes we trust most, hidden in the unspoken words and concealed actions of those closest to us. In the months and years that followed the public exposure of the Henderson family's secrets, the process of emotional recovery proved to be as complicated and harrowing as the events themselves. Laura and Daniel, now adults forced prematurely into a world of trauma and responsibility, struggled to redefine their identities beyond the shadow of their parents' control and the tragedies that had unfolded. Therapy sessions became a constant, structured framework through which they could begin to process years of suppressed fear, anxiety, and emotional manipulation. Gradually, they learned to articulate their experiences, to confront difficult memories without being consumed by them, and to rebuild a sense of trust that had been systematically eroded within their household. William and Margaret, similarly, faced the long and painful process of reckoning with their own actions and the consequences of decades spent prioritizing control and appearances over empathy and open communication. While neither could undo the damage done, both engaged in counseling and reflective exercises to understand the dynamics that had led to such devastation, confronting long-buried personal traumas and the rigid belief systems they had passed down to their children. Outside the household, the community continued to grapple with the shock of the revelations, the disparity between perception and reality serving as a stark reminder that appearances can be dangerously deceptive. Friends, neighbors, and even casual acquaintances were forced to question assumptions about the families in their own lives, recognizing that secrecy and dysfunction often operate in silence, invisible to those who observe only surface behaviors. For Laura and Daniel, rebuilding trust extended beyond their parents to relationships with peers, mentors, and extended family members who had previously been caught in the orbit of the household's hidden turmoil. They learned gradually that boundaries, honesty, and emotional openness were not only possible but essential for survival and personal growth. Over time, they pursued paths that allowed them to reclaim agency over their own lives. Laura focusing on advocacy and education, using her experience to support others who had endured trauma, and Daniel immersing himself in creative and intellectual pursuits that fostered self-expression and healing. William and Margaret, while living with the heavy weight of remorse and public scrutiny, began engaging with community programs that addressed family dysfunction, sharing their story as a cautionary tale in hopes of preventing similar tragedies elsewhere. The legal consequences had concluded, the media attention eventually subsided, but the psychological and social repercussions lingered, reminding everyone involved that the impact of secrets and repression extends far beyond a single event. Experts analyzing the Henderson case emphasize that recovery from such profound family dysfunction is neither linear nor complete, often requiring years of effort, reflection, and support, and that the lessons learned are crucial for understanding human behavior, family dynamics, and the potential dangers of silence and control. The tragedy also sparked broader conversations about the signs of emotional distress in households, the importance of early intervention, and the role of empathy and communication in preventing familial crises. For the Hendersons, these years of reflection, therapy, and gradual rebuilding were marked by moments of breakthrough and setbacks alike, illustrating that while the past could never be erased, conscious effort, understanding, and self-awareness could provide the foundation for healing and, eventually, a life lived with greater awareness and emotional honesty. In essence, the long aftermath of the tragedy became both a burden and an opportunity. A painful reckoning with human imperfection, but also a chance to redefine family, trust, and the capacity for forgiveness, even when the consequences of the past are irreversible. As the years passed, the story of the Henderson family settled into the collective memory of the community and the annals of true crime history, a haunting reminder of the destructive power of secrecy, control, and unaddressed emotional trauma. What had once been an outwardly perfect household, admired for appearances and accomplishments, became emblematic of the perilous gap between perception and reality. A cautionary tale about the human tendency to hide pain, repress emotion, and prioritize image over authenticity. For Laura and Daniel, the journey forward was a careful balancing act, honoring the lessons learned from their past while forging a future in which they could assert control over their own narratives, free from the suffocating influence of unspoken rules and the weight of parental expectation. William and Margaret, too, lived under the persistent shadow of consequence, confronting not only legal and social ramifications but the internal reckoning that comes with understanding how decades of secrecy and control had cascaded into irreversible tragedy. The broader community, while initially shocked and judgmental, gradually incorporated the story into a wider dialogue about family dynamics, mental health, and the warning signs of hidden dysfunction, with educators, psychologists, and social workers citing the Henderson case in discussions and trainings designed to prevent similar outcomes. Media portrayals, documentaries, and interviews brought attention to the nuanced realities behind headlines, highlighting the complexity of familial relationships and the subtle ways in which fear, pride, and secrecy can intertwine to devastating effect. Over time, the tragedy inspired conversations about the necessity of communication, empathy, and early intervention, reminding people that even the most seemingly ordinary households can harbor profound struggles. The story also left an enduring lesson about resilience, particularly in the lives of Laura and Daniel, who, despite the weight of trauma, managed to reclaim agency over their lives, channeling their experiences into growth, advocacy, and self-understanding. In the end, the legacy of the Henderson family secret, and its catastrophic consequences, serves as both a warning and a guidepost, illustrating that the cost of silence and repression can be staggering, yet the potential for recovery, understanding, and personal transformation remains possible even in the wake of profound loss. The tragedy of the Hendersons is a stark testament to the human consequences of long-buried secrets, the fragility of trust, and the delicate balance between love and control, reminding society that vigilance, compassion, and honest communication are essential to the health of any family. Ultimately, the story leaves a haunting, indelible impression. Appearances may deceive, perfection can mask peril, and the most devastating threats often originate not from the outside world, but from within the walls of our own homes. Through reflection, accountability, and the courage to confront difficult truths, the surviving members of the Henderson family, and the community that watched their story unfold, learned that even tragedy can provide insight, growth, and the imperative to value honesty, connection, and emotional authenticity above all else. The family secret, once hidden and destructive, became a catalyst for awareness, transformation, and a sobering reminder of the enduring consequences that accompany the choices we make in the shadows of fear and concealment.